Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today in our discussion on Behavioral Science 101, Introduction. For those of you who are new, my name is Mary McLennan. I am the Senior Advisor on Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General. I also lead an initiative called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which I'll come to shortly. But today's discussion was really geared toward those starting out with behavioral science in the UN. There are many of you we've heard from, and it's to provide you with an overview of what it is and some of the value it adds to the UN through some UN examples, and then have a bit of a discussion of where we could potentially go with it in the future as well. So before we get into the content of today, I did want to flag to you, we are part of UN Behavioral Science Week. So if you haven't joined sessions already, I encourage you to join the rest of the week, and I'll include in the chat the link to the agenda. So today we've had sessions on introductory behavioral science through to sludge reduction, which we will hear about potentially in today's session as well. We have sessions on topics ranging from health, climate, peace, and security as well. So lots to check out during the week. So as I mentioned, I lead the UN Behavioral Science Group, which brings together over 1,000 UN colleagues from more than 60 entities in 110 countries. There's quite a lot of interest and demand for behavioral science across the UN. This group ranges from not only different geographies in which we all work, but also with respect to domains from health, climate, gender, peace, and security is kind of reflected in that agenda for Behavioral Science Week, but also with respect to experience when it comes to behavioral science application. And although we do have some behavioral scientists in the UN, will be joining us today. Most of the colleagues in the behavioral science group are at the early stages of their journey. So this is very much a presentation geared towards those of you who are starting out and thinking about how you might apply behavioral science in your work overall. So that's at the more working level discussions, and at the senior levels of the UN, you might be aware that there's been quite a lot of support and buy-in for behavioral science, particularly from the Secretary General. It's called Behavioral Science, a critical tool for the UN to progress in its mandate, and also strongly encourages entities and colleagues across the UN to work together to apply behavioral science. That's what we do in the UN Behavioral Science Group. And you might also be aware of what's called our common agenda. This is the Secretary General's plan for his second term, which covers a lot of areas. It's quite an ambitious agenda, but within it is also what's called UN 2.0 and this quintet of change. So these are 5 areas the Secretary General has deemed important for the UN to be nimble and effective and deliver on essentially this ambitious agenda. These 5 areas are strategic foresight, data, innovation, digital transformation, and behavioral science. So it's really amazing to see us elevated up there with these important areas. And there'll be a lot more announced with respect to UN 2.0 over the coming months, and I encourage you to keep an eye out for that. Okay, so just to conclude here about behavioral science across the UN, again, I'll put in the chat some links to various things I've mentioned. So in addition to Secretary General's statement, there's also a guidance note from Secretary General really outlining the ways in which he sees further work in behavioral science across the UN. Also a report highlighting the experiences of 25 entities and a UN practitioner's guide to getting started with behavioral science, which we will cover very shortly in this presentation today. You can also join the UN Behavioral Science Group if you haven't done so already. I'll include the link to do that. Anyone in the UN can join, no matter your level of understanding, as I mentioned. You can also join if you are outside the UN as an observer. So we have colleagues from governments, international organizations outside the UN, academia, civil society. So again, please join the group to keep up to date with what we're doing. And then lastly, you can follow us on Twitter if you're interested in engaging us in a more real-time manner. Okay, so now on to the content of today's presentation. So we will be covering a few things. So first, we'll speak to the UN Practitioner's Guide to Getting Started with Behavioral Science. I will speak to it along with a colleague from the ILO. And this will be followed, by a presentation from Professor Liam Delaney. And we ask that throughout the presentations and discussions that we're basically will be doing over the next 20-25 minutes or so, put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, because it'll be hard to collect them all there in the Q&A box, and then also upvote the questions of your colleagues. That will enable us to have a more meaningful discussion with all of you. Okay. So now onto the presentation. As I said, I'll start with some background and context, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Claire Hobden, who's from the ILO, and she's worked with us over a number of years to produce the documents as we'll speak to, but also to apply behavioral science across the UN. So first, what is behavioral science? So behavioral science, as we define it in the UN, and we might get into a bit of this later on, is there are different definitions for what it means, but our kind of broad, overarching umbrella term is behavioral science referring to an evidence-based understanding of how people actually behave, make decisions, respond to programs, policies, and incentives. So when we think about our policies and programs, we often make assumptions about human behavior. we think people act a certain way in a place and time, but oftentimes they don't. So for instance, we might put all of our effort and thought and time into designing the program to be, perfectly the way we think it should be run. But then we realize that people don't actually take it up and are not using it. And why might that be the case? Or for instance, we think about adopting certain behaviors like vaccination uptake, and we think, hey, it's a good behavior to adopt. People should just be taking it up, but why are there not? There might be some behavioral implications to that we can go into much more detail and to understand from a different perspective. So where behavioral science adds value from previous discussions about behavior change across the UN is that we really take a deep dive understanding of human behavior and how context can shape our decisions and ultimately our follow-on actions and behaviors. So for instance, how it's novel is in two ways. So first, we draw from a diverse set of disciplines, from economics, psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, law, really lots of spaces that hasn't been done in this multi-interdisciplinary way, and also in a practical way as well. So taking this academic literature and applying it in a really meaningful way in practice. And then secondly, we test where possible. So we'll cover a little bit about that shortly, about how we do that. It could be online experiments, it could be field experiments, there could be many other methods we take as well. And so those are kind of the two components. We draw from diverse disciplines and we test, and we really take a deep dive of context. And we'll come shortly how we do that, some of the steps involved in applying behavioral science. So just broadly here, how behavioral science can help. So it can increase impact and enhance efficiency. So sometimes when we take a deep dive understanding of the context, as I said, we find things out that may be not obvious, but can be relatively cheap to do and can have a big impact on our ultimate goal. So this can mean enhancing efficiency, enhancing the impact, can save cost and time. There are other ways we can think about being efficient, and also help us design evidence-based policies. So as I mentioned, we draw from academic disciplines, we often test. There are lots of ways we can create evidence to really support what we recommend within policies or programs or internal operations such as administration as well, which is the last point here. So that's behavioral science. We can go in a bit more of the definitions and around that if as we go. It might become clearer to you as we walk through an example. So now in terms of thinking about what behavioral science is in the tailored to the UN context, I'd like to draw your attention to the Practitioner's Guide, and I'll put it in the chat again shortly. So it is basically a document developed by the UN system for the UN system. We consulted with many colleagues across the UN. And it covers the steps, it covers some context around how the UN has been applying behavioral science. And we also developed this in consultation with behavioral scientists from governments, academia, international organizations outside the UN as well. The colleagues with us today have all contributed to this document. So you can see the diverse set of opinions and views that have led to this document that really is tailored to the UN, as I mentioned. So it covers two main areas. The first is with respect to policy and programming. So it talks to how the UN can be more effective to really deliver what they're doing in an evidence-based way. And then the other area which it touches upon is this idea of administrative burdens and frictions, behavioral frictions that can impede people from doing what they want to do. So this could be both with respect to internal operations of the UN, so how colleagues do their jobs, whether it's procurement or travel, how we can make that more, remove the behavioral frictions. This is the big component of what a lot of colleagues have mentioned in the UN, but also in terms of external facing. So it could be, as I mentioned, programs. Are there barriers for people to access programs? Are there other ways of the UN's interfacing with people externally that we can reflect upon from a behavioral science perspective as well? Okay, so policy and program, administrative barriers, those are the two kind of key components that are mentioned in this document. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Claire, who will speak to an example of some of the steps outlined or the steps outlined in the document. Claire, over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Hi, everyone. So my name is Claire Hobden, and I work at the International Labour Organization. My primary role is to coordinate our work on domestic work, which I'll get to in a moment. But here I also supported Mary and the UN Behavioural Science group in developing this practitioner's guide. And in the guide, we try to outline really what some of the key steps are and give people, UN practitioners an opportunity to identify different ways of applying behavioral science depending on the level and capacity of the organization. But broadly speaking, there are these 5 steps that a behavioral intervention will go through. And the first one is really about defining the outcome and the target behavior, This is sort of something that I think we're broadly used to in the UN work, is identifying, what policy outcome we want. And here it's really translating it into a language that speaks more to behaviors. We'll go through an example in a moment. The next step is really the diagnostic, understanding the context, identifying the actors and the way these actors influence the behavior that you're out to either change or achieve. And then based on that diagnostic, you can design a behaviorally informed intervention. We highlight strongly the role of stakeholders in the development of each one of these steps, but particularly in the design level. And then finally, with more advanced levels of application of behavioral science, you can design experiments and actually test and evaluate the impact of the intervention that you designed. And with those findings, then you can either iterate, go back into another experimental process, or apply the findings to policies, or just communicate your findings. Many options there. So if you could go to the next slide. So I'll just walk you through an example that we conducted at the International Labor Organization to formalize domestic work in Argentina. So this is the first step, is defining the outcome. For us, it was clear that there are all of these domestic workers, meaning nannies, babysitters, elderly caregivers in Argentina, that are simply not registered to Social Security. In fact, the rate of registration, as you can see, this is our challenge, was just 30%. And so our target behavior was to get employers, households, to register their domestic workers to Social Security. We conducted a diagnostic. That's the second step on the next slide. And when we conducted the diagnostic, what we really wanted to do was get an understanding of the perceptions and the behaviors of employers of domestic workers and also domestic workers. And here we were able to diagnose that gap between your intentions and your actual behavior that Mary was referring to. So on the one hand, employers, we noticed they had this self-concept of themselves that they were good employers, right? Every employer thinks that they're better than the average employer. And they normally justify this by saying that they don't scream at the domestic worker unless they have to. You see, they set a very low bar for what it means to be a good employer. And they pay the minimum wage and they treat her like she's one of the family. But then the actual behavior, if you look at the right-hand column, their actual behavior is that they don't register the domestic worker to Social Security. And they claim that it's because the domestic worker doesn't want to be registered. And they think that it has something to do with the fact that she might lose benefits as a result of the registration. So this gave us kind of an overarching narrative wherein we heard that the employers thought that they were good employers, but they don't register the worker because the worker doesn't want to. And we also noticed that there was generally a lack of information on the process and on the benefits. Next slide, please. So this gap between somebody's self-concept and their actual behavior normally causes what we call a feeling of cognitive dissonance. It's a kind of a discomfort that our behaviors are not consistent with our beliefs about ourselves. So we used this to design a behaviorally informed intervention. And with the government of Argentina, the Ministry of Labor and Social Security sent out a behaviorally informed letter to households. And the letter was designed to create that feeling of cognitive dissonance by pointing out the gap between the self-concept of employers and their actual behavior. So roughly, it sounded like something, we know you're intending to be a good employer, but being a good employer also means registering your domestic worker to Social Security. And so then we gave them the information and the tools that they needed to conduct the registration, and also reminded them that it was actually a legal obligation. Next slide, please. So we designed this as an experiment with the government of Argentina that actually did the impact evaluation. They sent out the letter to 100,000 households, and they compared it to a control group of 79,000 households that received no letter at all. And through that process, we were able to evaluate the impact. And we found that the treatments had statistically significant effects. And overall, there was an increase of 8.9% in the rate of registration among a particular subgroup. Next slide, please. So in this case, we had positive results, which was great. And that's not always the case, but we can learn from negative results as well. And we talk about that in the practitioner's guide. But in this case, we used the learnings, we delivered it to, our constituents, which at the ILO is the government, but also the trade unions and the employers organizations. It helped us to generate insights on the profiles of the households that employ domestic workers, because that's something that right now is not really available in the national statistical data. And then we also figured out how we might adapt the findings in the next intervention. So we know now how to narrow the focus onto a particular group of employers of domestic workers, those who are working for very short hours. And it's also allowed us to start new research recently on identifying the barriers and enablers for these target groups. And this has happened partly also through a continued working relationship with the government of Argentina's Behavioral Science unit. Next slide, please. Oh, so actually, I think that's it. So thank you, Mary, for the opportunity. I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Claire, for that context and that background for you an example. So next, I want to turn it over to our featured speaker for today, Professor Liam Delaney. He's a professor in behavioral science at the London School of Economics and the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science. He's also the head of the department. He has extensive experience in applied behavioral science, not just within academia. He's worked with governments all over, from Ireland and other places. He's also been an advisor to us over a few years on topics ranging from ethics through to how to really embed behavioral science in organizations, which I think we'll hear about shortly. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liam to share a few remarks, and then we'll turn it over to all of you for the Q&A. So if you want to, I'll put the links, as I mentioned, to the UN Behavioral Science Week and the group in the chat. But if you have questions about either how to apply behavioral science to your work or the methods or even what it is, feel free to put them in the chat. This is very much an open space for any questions. So yeah, Liam, over to you.
Thanks, Mary. And I should just share my screen, right?
Yeah, if you can.
Perfect. Sorry, everyone. Hopefully that should be showing up.
In 1 second, maybe. There you go. Can you go full screen?
Great. Is that okay, Mary?
Yes, perfect. Thanks. Go for it.
Hello, everyone. It's a real honor to be here in the introductory session. It's a very exciting week of talks on behavioral science and public policy. As Mary said, I run the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science at LSE. Many of our graduates work in public policy across the world, including many alumni of our programs in UN agencies. As part of our program, we spend a lot of time speaking to policymakers, having collaborative sessions, including a weekly session where we look at applications of behavioral science around the world. I appreciate some of you will have a background in this area and some of you are coming to it new and trying to understand what's happening. So what I wanted to do with my talk was to outline some of the areas of discussion that are very live in this area and that I think will be of interest to the participants. There's clearly a discussion about the definition of behavioral science. It's something that has, it's a phrase that I think can mean different things to different people in terms of the broad behavioral sciences and the different areas, the different disciplines that make up behavioral science. I think it's fair to say that increasingly it's come to mean a particular thing in public policy context, which is very much an interdisciplinary and very applied area of knowledge. So looking at how insights from behavioral sciences can be brought together in public policy contexts to say something about important questions that have human behavior as an underpinning. And I think in the UN documents, you see a very pragmatic and a very solid definition of behavioral science that I think is one that's shared by many organizations that are applying this area. I think most excitingly, you're seeing a huge amount of innovation in between evidence and practice. So many of these academic literatures were quite theory-driven and quite lab-based in their inceptions, but increasingly you're seeing far more interaction between public policy and evidence structures, leading to a lot of innovation in how behavioral science is actually done and leading the academics to be challenged about how do they take what's happening in policy contexts and bring it back into the development of the area. So it's creating a very interactive space, which is very exciting and very positive. There's also a lot of discussion about cultural variation. Some of you would be familiar with some of the critiques of, the Western educated, white educated, industrial, rich, democratic country bias in psychology and in wider behavioral sciences. I think increasingly that's moving to not just thinking about who are participating in these studies and so on, but rather who's actually doing these studies. And one of the most exciting developments in the last decade has been an increasing move to global team-based behavioral science projects, which, as you'll see throughout the week, there's so many fascinating cross-country applications with really interesting cross-cultural underpinnings. So I think that is going to be, is both an emerging, but also going to be very much the future of behavioral science. Particularly as some of the applications are scaling into areas that are very important to people's lives. There's a lot of discussion about ethical issues. Some of that can be quite abstract, but increasingly people are looking at ways in which it can be brought to bear in a very pragmatic way into public policy, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So increasingly we're seeing the development of very, I think, usable ethical frameworks that can inform how projects are developed, and not just that ethics is a hurdle to overcome, but it's something that's inherent to how these projects can be respectfully done. So looking at models of respectful influence, how to really treat people with respect in the process of developing behaviorally informed policies. And I think as behavioral science scales, I think we particularly saw this with COVID, like any major area of knowledge, the public themselves begin to have opinions on the area, and it creates a discussion in the media and some interesting ways in which that transforms the way that behavioral science itself operates. I think a question that you'll see a lot this week is what structures will emerge, and we've had examples such as the Behavioral Insights team or the UN Innovation Network, where behavioral science has emerged either as a separate organization or within organizations, or people have networked across different parts of their organization. And there's a lot of innovation going on in that. I think what we'll see this week is particularly exciting in that direction, but it's still very fluid and very interesting as to how that will emerge. Excuse me, I'm just having a slight issue with the slide transition. So in terms of the ethical questions, as I said, I think this is fundamental, and I've talked a lot in our talks at LC about respectful influence, that we're really looking at how you bring a sort of ethical model of behavioral science right to the fore when we're looking at developing and designing these policies. So having questions such as fairness, openness, so these policies and the way that they're done should be transparent and really about respect. And I think we're seeing as well a very interesting emphasis on deliberation. So how do you consult people about policies that will affect them? And not only that you do that because it's the ethical thing to do, but also it will improve fundamentally the way that these policies will operate and scale and be sensitive to cultural context and so on. So I think that is something that has been there and it's emerging, but will very much be the future of the next generation of behavioral science, will be to integrate ideas coming from the behavioral literature with ideas from policy and from the wider ideas of deliberation and how to consult people and so on. And I think increasingly these sort of ethical frameworks will come to define how behavioral science operates in practice. So some final remarks, I would say that, respectful influence, finding models that allow large-scale behavioral change in areas such as climate, health, pandemic response. So in areas where people really want to coordinate to achieve outcomes for their societies, how do we employ behavioral science in a way that is respectful? I think increasingly looking at not just how does one influence individuals, but how are organizations structured in ways that achieve different types of outcomes. And I think there's been a really interesting emphasis in the last couple of years that you'll see throughout this week on how administrations interact with the public in terms of administrative complexity. as I said, I think broader ways of working between science and policy is going to mark the future of behavioral science. So more flexible, long-run collaborations, cross-cultural relevance, and what we'll call the heterogeneity revolution, or the fact that different people will respond differently to different things. So some of the core behavioral ideas that we'll discuss all this week, and I think you'll see increasingly an emphasis on how that will apply differently in different contexts. So I'm going to stop my remarks there and hand back over to Mary, and I hope we have a chance to discuss this both in the Q&A, but also throughout the week in the sessions.
Great, thank you for your presentation, Liam. There's a lot there to unpack. So we've spanned from what is behavioral science through to an example, through to where are we heading in the future, what are some potential considerations to think through. So I see there are a number of questions in the Q&A which are covering a wide variety of things. So just to note, if you would like to join the UN Behavioral Science group or check out UN Behavioral Science Week, the links are in the chat now. The recording of this will be available. If you go to the links in the chat, there's a session there to do that, to find the links to the recordings of the YouTube playlist. So you can join the UN Behavioral Science group. And the presentation will be available afterwards as well, for those of you who are interested in that. Okay, so there's a question for Claire, more of a clarification, I guess, around the example that she walked through. So how did you reach the test group while they have non-registered domestic labor? How did you practically do this? It'd be great to hear about that.
Sure, and it's a really good question, and it was not easy. But basically, we had to make some assumptions about the profile of households that might likely have a domestic worker. And to do that, we did look at the profile as a reference. We looked at the profile of households that had registered. So that data is available from the Social Security Administration. So we could get an idea of what some of the common factors are among those households. And then we looked at the broader universe, basically, and we created 2 or 3 criteria and did some tests as well right from the beginning to identify whether, on the sample that we collected to make sure that those criteria were being met. So we used household income as one of the factors, for example, and there was another criteria that was around household size, and another on whether the head of household was self-employed or an employee, which that is a local factor that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of myself, but that proves the point that you really need to develop these interventions and research methods with the people on the ground. So that was essentially how we kind of created the universe to run the experiment, and then to actually identify which households to send the letters to. That's where the Ministry of Labor and Social Security Administration were very helpful. We sent letters to households a little bit blindly, in the sense that we did not know, we could exclude households that we knew were registered to Social Security. But again, we were blind in the sense of we couldn't be certain if the households that we were sending the letter to had a domestic worker or not. But the sample size was large enough, and as a result, we were able to get statistically significant effects. I hope that answers roughly. It's a little bit technical.
Great, thanks for that, Clara. It's quite a specific problem or issue you're tackling, but really good to hear that. So next question, I think maybe I'll ask both of you. Maybe it's a bit of a broader question about how you apply behavioral science. So how do you know which behavioral science theory to apply in a project? We talked about all these different theories from the academic disciplines. How do you know which one might be relevant to increase domestic worker registration or any other issue? What are your thoughts there? Maybe Liam, over to you first. How do you know which behavioral science principle to apply?
Yeah, I mean, I think in having a good model of working together is very important for that. So like, for example, my experience in the Irish context is we have a network with people from various behavioral sciences that then interact with the policy community. So it's not, it's not a very linear process. It will be that the policy community brings problems and issues that are really substantive, and the interaction with the academic community is really an attempt to sort of filter the different ideas. Sometimes, different disciplines talk about the same things in different language, And the real job of behavioral science as it's integrated into policy is to try to find a way to meet in the middle of that. So that often it's not taking one theory and bringing it into policy, but it's rather having a discussion about, well, what's the essence of these theories as they apply to a very consequential outcome in the world, and how can that then be communicated? So, you know, if you're a pure theorist, it can sometimes be frustrating because it's quite applied focus. But on the other hand, it can sometimes, like if you take something like pension auto-enrollment or the example that Claire gave, it's often asking these questions that have, you know, really very strong societal impacts, and trying to answer it in a way that brings the behavioral sciences together. But maybe I'll pass over to Claire.
Yeah, I think that what we have found, I often think about the work that I'm doing on domestic work as a little bit starting from the ground up. So there's a huge amount of behavioral science research that's been conducted on different behavioral objectives, on different target groups in different countries and different regions. And so none of it would necessarily be directly applicable to domestic work. And so it's quite consistent with the philosophy behind the work that we do in general, which is to try to build these things from the ground up. So what we often did, instead of sort of looking for theories first and then applying them, there's a lot of expertise on the ground and throughout the organization about you know, what factors are at play in domestic work. And so we can develop a little bit our own theories from there and then test them out on the ground through these experiments. But one example that we did in Hong Kong, for example, where we were really starting from scratch. So we actually did a lot of in-depth interviews with our target group just to get the lay of the land and understand what was happening from their perspective. And then from there, we designed an online experiment to test some of the theories that we developed from that research. And then you can also root that in the theoretical literature, which, you know, ideally you have somebody on your team who's familiar with that theoretical literature, or you are connected to an academic team that is familiar with it, or quite quick on their feet to do the research. And I think bringing those two areas of expertise together is really the winning combination.
Thanks for that, Claire. Maybe I'll kind of draw back to the practitioner's guide, where we talk about this from an introductory perspective quite a bit of what are the steps, as Claire broke down, and how do you do that? So yes, you as anyone at the UN can start to think about applying behavioral science, but ultimately you might need to engage with a behavioral scientist to run it. So you will need to probably engage with a behavioral scientist to run a project. So there's knowledge that everyone should have, but then there's also certain skill sets, and the guide breaks that down in a way that's meaningful to the UN. There is one question, Claire, maybe building on that. Are there frameworks you identify, or kind of, I know the guide goes through some methods in terms of how we do the quote diagnosis, but what would you suggest in terms of, you've gone through this process in the UN before, any frameworks or sort of methods or range of methods you might want to explore?
Yes, well, definitely in the practitioner's guide, there is a nice resource there on frameworks. When we were doing the research for that guide, actually, there were a lot of them that came up that I think are all very useful. And honestly, I think there's some organizations that really favor one over the other, and they tend to apply it repeatedly, which is great because then you develop a real expertise in the application of a particular model. That has not been my experience so far. I tend to pick and choose a little bit depending on what we're doing. Depending on what feels like is the right tool basically for the job. But certainly you hear a lot about the COM-B model, you hear a lot about the East framework, you hear a lot about, you know, there are many of them out there. And I think fundamentally a lot of them share the same behavioral principles, but they're packaged in different ways. So in that sense, it really also depends on the type of work that your organization is doing and the context in which you'd be delivering these interventions. So I just really encourage you to take a look at the guide and see some of them for yourself.
Great, thanks for that, Claire. And I see one of the questions is the guide posted. So if you click on the Join UN Behavioral Science Group link, it's there. I'll link to the practitioner's guide. But Liam, what are your thoughts on all the frameworks that exist for behavioral science? What would you recommend to a behavioral science practitioner in the UN starting out? We have the guide, but you know, all the frameworks that exist. What would you say about that today?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, think if you look at something like the Behavioural Insights team who've used EAST, that is, you know, my academic hat on, I could tell you all the things that aren't included in making something easy, attractive, social and timely. But having said that, I mean, that it has become very popular in British policy for a reason, which is it's a very usable, evidence-informed framework that allows you to do very immediate things that you can test in areas where there's been, you know, difficulty bringing stuff in there. So I certainly think if you look at stuff like Mindspace and EAST, for particular specific types of problems, I think it's a fantastic way of generating a set of potential solutions that are informed by the evidence. I think if you're operating at a more strategic level, where you're looking at, you know, how will an entire, let's say you're looking at smoking across the whole global south or something like that, then something like those sort of frameworks can say something, but ultimately then frameworks like the behavioral change wheel or some of these more broader societal frameworks are needed. So I think the framework will sometimes depend upon the level at which you're operating at. So if you're operating at a level where you've got a specific question in a specific region at a specific time, actually some of the behavioral change frameworks that come from those are very useful and very usable. Whereas if you're operating more at a strategic level, I think you sometimes need things that have, you know, more large scale time dimensions and things like that in them.
Great, thanks for that. I think it kind of also underscores this element of it's not just a simple process of steps. There's a lot of contextualizing and thinking about how to apply behavioral science that needs to be carried out, and oftentimes in partnerships with behavioral sciences to think through which framework would be relevant to your issue or problem and why. So again, we're open to talking to you in the UN Behavioral Science group. So if you want to engage with us, we're happy to talk to you about your problems and your issues you're tackling with behavioral science. Okay, so maybe taking a little bit of a different turn. So I'm going to go towards Liam now. There are a few questions about people doing a second master's and wanting to learn more about behavioral science. And I think of people in the UN in a career, maybe what would you suggest to them who maybe want to take a degree, or how would one gain more behavioral science skills in a meaningful way? What would you suggest to them?
Well, engage with your network, I guess, would be something that's a good idea. There's obviously, you know, various executive programs in the area. Now I run one, so I could probably not with a straight face recommend that one, but as the might be conflicted, but in general, there's a lot of programs, you know, aimed at graduates, I think, and then they come out through that route. But for folks that are actually in place and you know, don't want to leave their organization for a year, you are starting to see both sort of short duration and then sort of 1 year to 2 year part-time courses evolving. I think it has to be more than that, though. I think we are going to see a shift towards having, look, we set up a global association for behavioral science to promote lifelong learning in the area. But I think it's a good question. I think the piece that's missing, and I'm working with a large group of colleagues in the UK now to set up a behavioral academy that would allow people to come in from organizations to do more short duration and networking. But I would say, truthfully, that's a gap. We've got quite a lot of provision at, say, undergraduate and like 1 year master's level, and then some element of executive master's level, and then some short courses. But so I think there's plenty of places to get started, and I'm happy to share some links and so on if I'm able to do so in the chat. But I think it's one for this week, and it's one for the area in general. So how do we actually embed training within organizations in a way that's, you know, more fitting to the career structure?
Exactly. And I think so a couple of things. So we're working on some training as well for the UN training, but it actually came up yesterday in the opening session of Behavioral Science Week when Dean Carlin, who's the chief economist at USAID, also an academic in the fields of behavioral science, he mentioned his comment was quite interesting of there's lots of training going on, but it's not always in the right place in the right time, right? People get trained and then they don't have the problem, and then they find the problem a year later. So it's also kind of not just training period, but knowing the right skills in the right place in the right time. So we're reflecting upon that. And Liam, maybe if I can add one ask onto that question. So there's a colleague who has recently graduated from a program in behavioral and experimental economics. And how would one get started with these skills? What would you suggest to someone starting out with maybe some background in these concepts or ideas in terms of the career trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, running a master's program in the area and an executive master's program in the area, spend a lot of time talking to the students about that. And I always say, you know, don't restrict it to being, I want to be a behavioral science person in a behavioral science group, if you know what I mean. And that can be excellent when it works out, but it's also a way of thinking. So, we're moving to primarily services economies across the world. We're moving to, public policy environments where human behavior really important. So I think one thing is just to keep an open mind when you're going into organizations. And if you look at a lot of the people, I mean, like yourself, like others who've gone into these areas, they've not gone in primarily started and said, I want to be a behavioral scientist and I want to, they've sort of kept an eye on where those policy directions are going. So a lot of my students now, some of them are working in things like behavioral insights teams, but some of them are working in regulatory agencies or they're going into policy, and they just bring an insight to it. They bring a way of thinking about, some of these questions that then stimulate projects or stimulate ways of thinking. So my advice would be, yes, definitely keep an eye on the roles that are, have behavioral insights in the title or whatever, but also just think more about what the policy questions are. So if it's an area like climate change or pandemic response or so on, there's lots of ways in which the type of things you're doing in those programs would influence the way you would work if you went in through, other routes.
Great, thanks for that, Liam. And Claire, you're a behavioral scientist working in the UN. What would you suggest to somebody who wants to get training in this space or maybe start within their entity? I mean, maybe it's part of our conversation tomorrow, but what would you suggest to colleagues who are exploring this?
Well, I, again, maybe have to be transparent that I'm an alumna of the LSE Behavioral Science Master's Program. I went through the executive program because I wanted to hold on to my job at the same time. And it became extremely useful, actually, because that experiment that I referred to in Argentina was really the theoretical basis was developed. I developed it during the master's program and then implemented it following the program because the collaboration with the government was taking some more time. So I think that was really kind of a winning combination. By being in our organizations, we have a certain access that we don't necessarily have otherwise. So to be able to combine that academic training with your work at the United Nations or elsewhere, if you're in another organization or company, I found that was really the most helpful.
Great, thanks for that, Claire. There are lots of opportunities to learn across the UN too with us as we go. Okay, so I see I'm going to group a number of questions here. I think they're interested in your comments, Liam, about weirder and kind of cross-country context of behavioral science application. So one is, to what degree do behavioral science concepts vary across contexts? So are they effective everywhere? What do we know about that from maybe the scientific literature? How should we be interpreting behavioral science as people who work all over the world? So maybe there are lots of questions around that theme. So maybe I'll leave you to expand upon that a little bit more, and maybe Claire too as well. What would you say in addition to that point?
I think it's as I said, it's one of the things that will define the next few years. It's not like people haven't been thinking about it or doing a lot on it. It's very much the case that these were very Western focused ideas. If you go back 20 or 30 years ago, it was very, it was coming out of particular types of economics that was predominantly US and UK, particular types of social psychology, again, that was very Western focused. I think behavioral science, as you're talking about it this week, isn't going to be a sort of Western focused area. I think it's coming from a place where some of the stuff was. But if you look at the type of work that the World Bank are doing, that you're doing in the UN, if you look at groups like BeSci in Kenya, look at all the stuff that's happening in India. I mean, that's getting to a stage where it's bubbling to that sort of collaboration across all those groups across the world is going to increasingly define, including with philanthropists and all of these sort of actors, is going to define, I think, what behavioral science is as it goes into policy. And it's tremendously exciting because it is leading us to go back and interrogate concepts that had already been there, but also, I mean, people are using phrases like co-designed, et cetera, but I think mainly it's decentering what had been a Western focused literature, and really, as that's happening, it's throwing up all of these really interesting questions, like the people on the questions are asking, like, how does it depend on cultural context? And Michael Mutterkrishnan, my colleague here in LSE, for example, is working with the World Bank on a culture measure that's integrated into their studies across countries. And there's just so much exciting stuff happening in that area, which I think one of the things that'll come across this week is, there's such an awareness of that now, but I think it'll define a lot of what behavioral science is in the next few years.
Definitely. I'll turn over to you in a second, Claire. I'll pick up on one more question and as we transition. So there's also a comment about to what degree are we engaging with institutions in the Global South working in this space? So maybe, I mean, there's a ton going on. Liam mentioned some of it, but there are countries like Argentina's one where Claire's work, there's work happening. There's also lots of work in India. There are different various corners of Africa working in the space as well. So yes, there's a lot happening, not just on the context, but from these countries, research being generated, people running projects in the different country contexts. Maybe I know Claire's worked in Argentina with behavioral scientists there, so maybe she can also speak to some of the work in the Global South and how that's evolved too.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to recognize that this is one of the more exciting reasons why the UN is taking up this work, right? I think we need to make it local. I think it was always supposed to be. I feel like the research instruments and the experimental methodologies are applicable just about anywhere with the proper adaptation. And when we develop the theories, at the ILO, we're developing them really through stakeholder engagement. I mean, we're interviewing people, as I was saying before, and I think that that also creates that knowledge from the ground up, and it accounts for cultural factors along the way, let's say. Then I think, yeah, we are applying this primarily in contexts that are, more developing countries, I would say. But I also want to point to the fact that there are situations in countries all around the world that are underrepresented in behavioral science. It's not just across countries, across country contexts. And some of the research that I found most exciting was seeing how these behavioral science findings were applicable to the poor, people who were living in any kind of resource poor settings. And so there is research happening there. It is a little bit what inspired me to look further into it. And I do think that we have to recognize that there is this whole field that preceded what we know as behavioral science today, that was sort of behavior change, more broadly speaking. And I think that there's a lot of cross-pollination that can happen there as well. And on that school is definitely firmly rooted in the Global South. So I'm sort of excited about that coming more into the world of behavioral science today. I agree with Liam that there's a lot of potential there, and I guess we can only encourage the people on this webinar who are concerned about it to get into the ring and help bring it a little bit more firmly rooted into the Global South.
Okay, thanks for that, Claire. Okay, so moving on to another point which Liam brought up around the ethical considerations. So we have some various questions around risks to applying behavioral science, also thinking about what privacy aspects about behavioral science, when we do this, when we roll out these methods and applications. So maybe related to the point about the Global South, but also more broadly, data, research, kind of what should we be considering when it comes to behavioral science application? Maybe Claire, over to you in terms of the project you're in, maybe what did you consider in terms of ethics and thinking through the aspects of it?
Yeah, this was a challenging one because we don't have a body that already deals with ethics. So when we started out the research, I went through an ethics procedure actually through the LSE. And then since then, really, whenever we've collaborated with universities or research centers to go through the ethics, the research and ethics procedures that they've provided, there's also, this nice trend to pre-register experiments that we have started doing as well. And this is to prevent basically the fudging of results in all sorts of different kinds of ways. So you pre-register your experimental design and kind of your hypotheses and what results you think will come out of it. And that also helps with the ethics. I find that with the type of research that we do, it tends to be considered low risk. And so although it seems very daunting at first to go through this ethics procedure, it's actually quite straightforward and very helpful to get you to think through how you might be putting your target group in a situation of vulnerability. So in general, I've found it very enriching.
Liam, over to you. I know you have the 4 Good framework, which is very helpful to think through things. So what would you say about this point?
We spend a lot of time on this. I would say there's the points that Claire raised are very important in terms of how you would assess different types of risks. I think for the ethics framework, what we primarily have in mind is how do you, more broadly speaking, treat people with respect? And I think you see, particularly with the dawning of particular types of AI, you're in scenarios where messages could be distributed to people at scale that could have all sorts of effects. And I think we could make this very, very complicated. But in general, I think if you've got built into the way you think about this, just a fundamental notion that you want to treat the people that are going to be affected by these policies with respect, it actually rules out a lot. For example, it rules out things like knowingly spreading disinformation. It rules out things like, knowingly harming people. It doesn't quite tell you, as some of the people are asking in the chat, what level of transparency to have. So, for example, I don't think it's always the case that you need to tell each individual that, this is one of a number of letters, or, we've changed the administrative structure and we need to inform every single person about this. It could be simply that you have a section on the website that says, look, we do these things. And I've worked with many organizations where it's come down to that. It's just simply saying, look, we quite transparent about what we're doing. This is evidence to improve policy. And many of the organizations, by the way, some of the more potentially unethical aspects of behavioral science are things that they wouldn't consider anyway. So, you know what I mean? They already have quite advanced procedures for ruling out doing things like that, or would have people that would simply know not to do things like that. But I think what we're trying to do with the ethics framework is really just to put respect rather than change. I mean, I think behavioral change is a subset of what you're trying to do when you're looking at human behavior in settings like climate change and so on. It's really, have you got respectful processes? Are you integrating evidence about humans? Are they being spoken about in a way that, is respectful? So I better stop because I could go on for a long time on that. But I do think that would be my nub, would be that you've got something at the start of this that has respect as being the sort of core principle.
Great, thanks for that, Liam. And that's a nice takeaway for the webinar today. Like when you think about behavioral science, keep that in mind as well. Okay, so maybe going on, picking up on one thing you mentioned a little bit, so the AI, artificial intelligence side of things. So thinking about some of the methods of an experiment, someone suggested here the idea of a digital twin. Can we simulate sort of using artificial intelligence and data, various ways of testing? So maybe just more broadly, to what extent can behavioral science and AI come together to be applied either in the UN or outside? What are your thoughts on that? Maybe starting with Claire, do you have any thoughts on AI and behavioral science?
We have not experimented much with it yet, if at all. I think that it's very interesting and can definitely, I know that there's some organizations who have started using things like chat bots and collecting data that way. And I think it's an area that we would want to explore a little bit further, because certainly reaching our target population is really difficult. And one of the areas in which they do congregate is online. So finding out ways to actually mine that data a little bit more in a way that, again, respects certain ethical principles is something that we intend to look into, but haven't done yet.
Yeah, I think you'll be hearing from Stuart Mills, who's one of our colleagues here, who wrote a really interesting book recently on behavioral science and AI. I mean, behavioral science and AI have interacted all the way from the beginning. So, the people like Herbert Simon, who developed early artificial intelligence, also developed, most of the early phases of behavioral science. And there's reasons for optimism, right? In terms of like genuinely, and similarly with data science, as all of this information becomes usable, if it's harnessed in a way to improve human welfare, and there's a real understanding of human welfare embedded into it and respect for human beings embedded into it, there's all sorts of ways in which it can extend people's capacity to make information manageable. But it means clearly all sorts of ways to do the opposite. But I feel my basic heuristic in something that's incredibly complicated is that things like data science teams or AI teams embedded within complex organizations should have a strong element of behavioral science in them to look at questions like human well-being, choice overload, the potential for people to lose trust in those institutions if they don't believe that what is being presented as a human is actually a human. You know, so all these questions that I know AI folks are looking at, but I do think these are, you know, questions that need significant behavioral input, or else, you know, you could get substantive loss of trust in any communication coming from any agency over the next few years.
Yeah, that's a nice introduction to maybe this discussion, as you mentioned on Thursday, when we'll go into much deeper in terms of this topic of behavioral science and AI. Okay, so I think we have time for maybe one more question. I might take one that is related to, again, something I think Liam touched upon in terms of COVID, some of the lessons we learned from behavioral science, and particularly in emergency response settings. So we talk a lot about Claire's example of this nice experiment, which was run over, I guess, a period of time. But how can we, to what extent, I guess is the question, to what extent can we apply behavioral science in emergency settings? And how, if we can? Maybe Claire, over to you to start with that.
Yeah, I was thinking back to some of the presentations that we heard from other UN colleagues in previous UN behavioral science weeks, looking at, you know, these sort of nimble or rapid methods of assessment in contexts where you really don't have the time, essentially, to design a full scale experiment. And I was thinking that some of those examples are actually documented in the UN behavioral science report, right, that UN published a few years back. And some of the ones that really stood out to me, well, I mean, it's really not necessarily an environment to run a full-scale experiment, but definitely an environment in which to you know, you can do these very, very small, short-term, not quasi experiments, let's say, not necessarily a full-scale thing, but I think there have been examples of organizations that have done that. And more importantly, I think it's about bringing in lessons learned from behavioral science in other contexts that you can apply kind of in the immediate. So it might be an area of application more than an area of testing.
All right, thanks for that, Liam. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we do a session on behavioral science and large-scale risk in LC. I've run it for several years now, and I had the experience of being the first Irish academic on the behavioral group in the Irish COVID response. And my feeling is the networks that are emerging through WHO in particular will be very helpful, because one issue that happened, particularly in countries like the UK, is that there was confusion, I think, at the start of the pandemic as to what behavioral science meant in the context of an emergency response. And it took them quite a while to resolve that, which I don't think was helpful. So I think you need pre-existing networks, and this comes out very much in the WHO work and in the work that you're trying to do, so that there's a common understanding of what folks can contribute from the behavioral perspective, and can be set up quite rapidly, so you don't have this forming phase that takes that you don't have time for in the middle of an emergency. And I do think in development of behavioral science, you'll see that being a lot sharper in the near future. But could probably say a lot more about that, but I think we're done for time.
Yeah, thank you, Liam. Thank you for that. I think there's still more questions to go through. I'm sorry, but there's some really good ones, but we have to close it up for today because we have the next Behavioral Science Week session starting in just 1 minute. So I'll say thank you very much to Liam and Claire for joining us. It was great to hear your insights. And yeah, so there are links in the chat to check those out. Claire put the report to the UN Behavioral Science report if you're interested in that as well. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you at sessions later on this week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.